It starts with a question no one can answer in the moment. How many shells will it take to bring down that one aircraft? 100, 1,000, or tens of thousands? The truth learned the hard way in World War II is that shooting at a fast, distant target in a shifting sky is a game of probability. You're not aiming at where the plane is. You're betting on where it will be by the time your shell arrives and hoping that when it bursts, enough steel fills the right cube of air. Today, we'll pin real numbers to the problem by gun, by fuse, by target, and see how technology moved the odds from hopeless to hard but possible. Music. Before we can talk numbers, we need to be clear about what we're measuring. When people ask how many shells per downed aircraft, they're really asking about one metric, rounds per kill RPK. Most of the time, these aren't neat lab-tested figures. There are campaign averages pulled from months of combat. That means multiple batteries firing at the same target, changing weather, different altitudes, and a lot of aircraft that are damaged in the flak box, limp away, and crash later, or never fly again. Keep that in mind throughout. We're dealing with big picture numbers that smooth out a chaotic reality. First, we'll see how flak really works. An anti-aircraft shell doesn't chase an airplane. The crew predicts where the plane will be when the shell arrives and detonates the shell near that point. The goal is a near burst that throws a lethal cloud of fragments through the space the aircraft is about to occupy. Two ideas are doing the heavy lifting here: time of flight and lethal volume. A heavy shell may take 10 or 15 seconds to reach a high bomber. In that time, the target has moved hundreds of meters. Wind has pushed the shell and gravity has bent its path. So the battery must aim ahead and above, not where the plane is now. The shell doesn't need a direct hit. It needs a near burst. The radius, within which fragments can rip control lines, puncture fuel tanks, or kill crew, is the lethal radius. Larger shells throw more fragments over a bigger volume, which raises the per-shot probability. Those two facts lead to two very different ways of shooting. With predicted fire, radar and directors do the math, computing a lead point and a fuse time. So, salvos burst inside a moving box the aircraft is about to fly through. When prediction breaks down or the target's hard to track, crews switch to barrage fire, filling a slice of sky with timed bursts to build a fence the aircraft must cross. Either way, the math is brutal. If each round has only a tiny chance of causing lethal damage, you need a lot of rounds before a kill becomes statistically likely. Now we'll look at fuses because detonation timing is the whole game. A simple contact fuse only explodes on impact, which is fine for tanks or ships but useless against a bomber thousands of feet up. So, anti-aircraft crews relied on mechanical time fuses, a little clock set to detonate after a precise interval so the burst happens near the predicted point. When the math was perfect, they worked. When range, wind, or timing were off by a hair, you got an expensive puff in empty air. Some units stacked barometric altitude-set fuses to build fixed curtains of bursts, but those were too crude for precision work. Then late in the war came the proximity fuse VT, a tiny radio that senses a target and detonates when it gets close. The fuse didn't make every round a hit. It simply made near bursts happen automatically when rounds passed close enough to metal. The effect on probability was enormous. In practice, German and early war British heavy flak mostly fought with time fuses, while late war US and British naval guns adopted VT. To make those fuses useful, you also need good fire control. A modern heavy flak position was a complete system. Observers evolving into radar sets, predictors that turned speed and heading into lead angles and fuse settings, and power-assisted mounts that kept batteries slewed together. The better the radar and predictor, the more often bursts arrived in the right place at the right time, and the more the RPK dropped. Even so, RPK often remained high because 5 things drove RPK up or down. Start with caliber and shell. Light guns 20 to 40 mm Spitfire, but each burst has a tiny lethal radius. Heavy pieces 88 to 128 mm shoot slower, yet their shells reach higher and break into far larger, deadlier clouds of fragments. Then there's the fuse. A mechanical time fuse needs perfect math and a little luck. A proximity fuse decides for itself when it's close enough to trigger, and that single change multiplies effectiveness. Next comes fire control. Radar and directors that aim where the aircraft will be when the shell arrives, Not where it is when you pull the lanyard. The target and geometry matter just as much. Altitude, speed, approach angle, tight formation, or hard jinking. All of it tilts the odds. And finally, crew proficiency and density of fire. Well-drilled crews waste fewer rounds and concentrated battery stack probabilities by filling the right volume of sky at the right moment. With the mechanics clear, let's look at real numbers starting over Germany in 1944. Picture U.S. heavy bombers at altitude locked into formation while German heavy flak throws up a storm. 88s, 105s, and 128s guided by radar and directors. Wartime German assessments summarize, later in post-war studies give stark averages for shells fired per heavy bomber shot down. The 80mm Flak 36 is often quoted at around 16,000 rounds per bomber. The improved 80mm Flak 41 has that into the 8,000 range. Step up to the 105mm guns, and you're in the ballpark of 6,000 per bomber. At the top end, the 128mm guns, especially from fixed sights and flak towers, get down around 3,000 shells per bomber. Why does RPK drop as the caliber rises? Bigger shells burst into larger fragmentation envelopes, so each round sweeps more sky. Heavier guns also reach the altitudes where the bombers fly without losing ballistic predictability. And at those heights, better director control keeps salvos where they need to be. But even the best heavy flak is still spending thousands of rounds for one confirmed heavy bomber kill. That's the scale of the air war over the Reich. Now jump to Britain in 1940 and 1941 during the Blitz. Night fighting with early radar and searchlights was ugly at first. In the Thames Medway sector, September 1940 saw figures around 20,000 shells per downed bomber at night. But watch what technology and organization did in just a few months. As radar matured, predictors improved, and searchlights were centrally controlled, RPK fell rapidly. By January 1941, some sectors were reporting around 4,000 shells per kill. By February, roughly 3,000, and national tallies continued trending downward as the system improved. The lesson is simple. Radar predictors and coordinated control can cut RPK by an order of magnitude in a single winter. Now to the Pacific, late 1944 and 1945, where the U.S. Navy measured rounds per kill by caliber against kamikaze attacks. Here the data is crystal clear because the Navy tracked it carefully. On the same 5-in gun, changing only the fuse changed everything. With mechanical time fuses, 5-in batteries often needed around 1,000 to 200 rounds per kill. Switch to VT proximity fuses, and the figure drops to roughly 300 rounds per kill. A 3 to 4 times improvement with the same ships, the same crews, and the same mounts. Lighter weapons were far less efficient. The 3-in sat in the hundreds per kill, the 40mm in the low thousands, the 20mm around 9,000, and the 50 caliber machine guns well above 28,000 rounds per kill. It's not that light guns were worthless. They were vital at very short range and for finishing shots. But their lethal radius was tiny, and pilots could jink or dive through those envelopes in seconds. The VT fuse, by contrast, automatically created near bursts without perfect time settings, and that crushed RPK into the hundreds. Having seen what weapons and fuses can do, let's talk about the targets. Because the type of aircraft changes everything. Start with high-altitude bombers. They're big and their courses are predictable, which sounds like an advantage for the defenders, but the shells take a long time to get up there. The formation is tight and altitude magnifies every tiny error. Even beautifully predicted bursts may goof near the wrong airplane. That's why the rounds per kill climbs into the thousands. Drop down to medium-altitude bombers and dive bombers. Here, time of flight is shorter and speeds are a bit lower. If a dive bomber commits to an attack run, the geometry steadies for a moment and RPK falls compared with the high-altitude stream. You're still solving a moving problem, just with more forgiving numbers. Now consider low-flying fighters and fighter bombers. For heavy guns, these are nightmare targets. Tiny engagement windows, high speed, violent jinks. Heavy flak becomes inefficient to the point of irrelevance. The job shifts to light and medium AA, 20 to 40mm cannon, 3-in and 5-in guns. Yet even there, the per kill cost stays high because the lethal radius is small and you only have seconds to work with. At sea, torpedo planes and suicide attackers compress the problem even further. Head-on or low crossing, closing fast. This is where VT fuses on 5-in mounts change everything. You don't have to guess the millisecond anymore. The shell decides when it's close. RPK plunges into the hundreds on those heavy mounts. The lighter guns still need thousands of rounds. Their lethal volume is just too small, finally. Formation behavior matters. Tight bomber boxes offer mutual protection, but they also make paths more predictable, letting Flak set walls of bursts along the route. Looser formations are harder to bracket and can push RPK up, though they pay for that with fewer guns supporting each other. Different targets, different formations, and a very different price in steel for every kill. Geometry matters too. Crossing shots demand more lead and more precise timing. Any error pushes the burst behind or ahead. Head-on or tail-chase engagements compress angular error, but swing range rapidly. Great for VT fuses that don't need perfect time settings. Over land, many batteries favored predicted crossing boxes for bomber streams. At sea, defenders preferred head-on lanes because ships control the approach corridor. Predicted fire is efficient when you can track the target well. Radar returns arrestable, altitude is known, and the aircraft is not violently maneuvering. Barrage fire is a backup. Build a curtain at the expected altitude and bearing or stack several altitude layers. It's ammunition hungry, but against a large formation or through cloud, it may be the only way to put fragments where aircraft will definitely pass. RPK rises in barrage firing because many shells are near misses in the wrong place. But the tactic still inflicts damage, forces formations to break, and degrades bombing accuracy. Of course, the aircraft fought back. Crews and planners tried to push RPK up again. They changed altitude and routing Toskert known belts and flak towers, forcing defenders to guess. They dropped window chaff to clutter radar scopes and wreck the predictors' clean inputs. Raids were timed with tight schedules and diversions. Saturating defenses, Sono battery could track every stream at once. Under heavy fire, bombers used jinking and the cork crew. Violent energy sapping maneuvers that threw off fuse settings and lead angles. Others went low, slipping under heavy gun envelopes and trading one danger for another. Every measure aimed to widen the defenders' error bars and force a switchback to ammunition-hungry bargages. Tactically, that raised survival odds. Strategically, it shifted the burden to logistics. Behind every RPK number sits a logistics bill. If it takes thousands of shells to down on aircraft, every raid becomes a logistics operation. Ammunition stockpiles drain fast. Fuses, especially late-war VT, turn into production choke points. Heavy guns chew through barrels and recoil parts, pulling crews into constant maintenance cycles, and all that steel has to move. Rail wagons, trucks, and ships hauling crates to gun lines and flak towers, which means defenses can only be dense where supply can actually keep up. So when you read that a single city defense fired hundreds of thousands of rounds over a campaign, you're seeing the price of probability counted in steel, time, labor, and fuel. If those campaign numbers sound extreme, here's the math in plain language. If a single shell has a 1 in 10,000 chance of producing a lethal effect, you expect really 10,000 rounds per kill on average. Improve your fuse, your radar, and your prediction so that each shot has a 1 in a 0.0 chance, and the expected rounds per kill falls to about a 0 and. That's the story of Flak in one line. Raise the per shot probability, and RPK collapses. In World War II, Flak wasn't about perfect shots. It was a numbers game. Radar, directors, and proximity fuses turned that game from tens of thousands of shells per kill into hundreds in the best late war systems. When you can't change the target, change the probability. That's how engineering wins air wars.